Howdy, howdy. Hey, Linda. You win the first in the chat award. Not sure what that gets you, but for what it's worth, there it is. All right. So I hope everyone's afternoon is going well. I've been busy today, jumping from my streams to over at Izzy's, just shooting the shit, really. Anyhow, we will get started since I was running late. I was sitting here, I all of a sudden got a chill and had to get a sweatshirt. So I guess that's me getting older. Hey, Jess. Thank you. Thank you. I'm trying to, I believe, build something of value to people. So we are going to start this lighter-hearted. I am warm now, Linda. That t-shirt wasn't cutting it for some reason. Feels like it's gotten cooler from this morning. So, alrighty. 1054 and all that. A lighthearted history of the Catholic Church. So this is starting with the great schism of 1054, where the church split from to Eastern Orthodox and the Western Church, which is the Catholic Church as we know it, the Roman Catholic Church as we know it. Yeah, definitely, Linda. Temps are dropping. I don't want to walk out to the restaurants and get something to eat. So, anyway, it's good to have you here, Jess. It was good seeing you over there at Izzy's. So, I'm gonna make as many appearances as I can to get the word out. Also, let me. How you doing, VOP? I want to drop this link for anyone who doesn't have it. So Tuesday, right? You've got to go all the way until then. So that is Jeff's channel where him, Scotto, and I do the nutty things that we do. Sorry, I have a cat on my desk, as you all well know. Anyway, let's get started here. So Carl Keating, he does a lot of writing on the Catholic Church. Look him up. He does good stuff if you're interested in the history of the church. I'm not going to do all the praise stuff for the book. So again, 2022. So, a fragmentary preface. Countless histories of the Catholic Church have been written by exalted historians to instruct those in the pews on the story of their church, and more urgently to exalt the reputations of the historians. These efforts largely have failed in both regards. The historians are little remembered, and little of what they taught has been absorbed by Catholics who have read their histories or who have watched the motion picture adaptations. The sad result is that most Catholics know only disjointed fragments of church history, but that is better than not knowing anything at all. In these pages, the disjointed fragments have been collected for the recollection of said Catholics and for the instructions of the next generation. Periods of 500 years. It is commonplace among historians to observe, as if no one else has ever made the observation, that church history, like the history of the West in general, has fallen into periods of 500 years or so. First, there were the first centuries. Appropriately enough, they ended with the fall of Rome in 476. But we'll round it off to the year 500 to make the observation more observable. The next 5 centuries were the Dark Ages. There wasn't much to see there. There seldom is in the dark. That period ended in the year 1000, which was an even rounder number than 500, its roundness leading to all sorts of end-of-the-world fears that would have topped only the millennium later with the Y2K kerfuffle. At which point, nothing happened, just as nothing happened in 1000. The third period of 500 years began with the transition from the low Middle Ages to the high Middle Ages in the 13th century, mostly, and then transitioned into the Renaissance, which was a high point for art, particularly if you lived in Italy, and a low point for political intrigue, particularly if you lived in Italy. The fourth period of 500 years began in 1500. This period is known as the modern era because anyone writing about it was born at the tail end of it, and all such writers want to be considered modern rather than, say, middling, which was what the writers living in the Middle Ages were, or so people said. So much for the bird's eye view. Now we turn to specifics of Catholic history, so far as they are understood or misunderstood, often enough, both at the same time. Yeah, good point, Woodrow. There was no tech concerns like Y2K. I mean, maybe. I mean, you could take the scientific achievement of the recurved bow that would penetrate armor from 100 yards as a world-ending thought. Battlefield technology mainly. I would venture to say. Pentecost. The history of the Catholic Church begins with its founding by its founder, who informed the first pope, Peter, that he, the founder, would build a church. Always true to his word, since he himself was the word, the founder did so. Called within a lifetime the Catholic Church because it was meant for men everywhere. Catholic means universal, which in turn means everywhere. The church came into the world on the Feast of Pentecost. On its very first day, the church received 3,000 new recruits. They became convinced by listening to the apostles preach in the listeners' own disparate languages. This was before the advent of captioned videos, so everyone in Jerusalem was suitably impressed, except for a Pharisee named Saul. No, it's not over again, Cap. We hadn't even gotten past really the introduction to the book. So good afternoon. A crashed ship on perhaps the Isle of Patmos. Paul and Peter in Rome. The first great Christian missionary was Paul of Tarsus. His actual name had been Saul, but he changed it under an early version of the Witness Protection Program. Paul was noted for his many voyages to distant places. He seldom was able to convince any of his friends to accompany him because he had the unfortunate habit of getting shipwrecked. He wrote epistles. The nascent Christian churches around the Mediterranean, often scolding them, often praising them. The scolding came naturally to Paul, inasmuch as he was brought up a Pharisee, and the praising came naturally to him, also because he was a model Christian. Hey, Misty. Eventually, Paul ended up in Rome as a prisoner. He was a Roman citizen, so his jailers had to treat him more tolerably than they treated other prisoners. He was allowed to have water. While in prison, Paul met up with his longtime friend Peter, who was the earthly head of the church. Peter had been hiding out in Rome, clandestinely tending to his flock, when someone finked on him. Ever since, the surname Fink has held unsavory connotations. Oh no, Finkel, you're in trouble. At length, the jailers tired of having the two apostles as their charges. Peter was crucified upside down, and Paul lost his head. They were buried in different places. Paul was buried outside the walls of Rome, and Peter was buried smack dab beneath the center line of the basilica that bears his name. John the Evangelist. The last apostle to die was John. He lived until the end of the first century, which meant he lived nearly as long as Bob Hope and Irving Berlin. But he was unaware of that because those two hadn't yet come to Ephesus, where John's tomb still may be found. John is credited with writing the fourth gospel and a trio of epistles, and was known as the disciple from whom Jesus loved. This is not to suggest that Jesus didn't love the other disciples. Whether John, who also who wrote the book of Revelation, is a matter of dispute. Some biblical scholars say that it and John's Gospels are so dissimilar in style that they could not have come from the same hand. Other scholars, not having confined themselves to reading the silted prose of biblical journals, argue that writers alter their styles as they age and as they change genres. And so these scholars assert that John wrote Revelation as well as the Gospel. A curious thing is that the first group of scholars insists that the writer of Revelation, like the writer of the fourth Gospel, was named John, though he was a different John. This reminds one of the famous remark that Homer was not written by Homer, but by another man of the same name. So after the apostles. At the end of the first century, the apostolic age ended because there were no more apostles. They all had gone to their respective rewards. The period that followed sometimes is called the post-apostolic age, but more commonly is called the second century. That century and the following ones were when the leading Christian writers were known as the fathers of the church. There's a disagreement about when that age ended. Traditionally, in the East, the end coincided with the death of John Damascene, who died in 749. In the West, also by tradition, the end coincided with the death of Isidore of Seville, who died in 636. This means there was a fatherless vacuum of 113 years in the West, but no one noticed because Western society was in turmoil and they had better things to do than try to match the East father for father. I just saw that, Woodrow. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Especially when you would put a Greek fire in said catapult and besiege cities with it. John the Baptist and Baptists. All of the earliest Christian writers were Catholics because all of the Christians were Catholics. This is disputed by modern-day Baptists who hold that their denomination was founded by John the Baptist. This is a curious position because if true, then their church was founded before the church founded by Christ. It's a curious thing how everything that we've been reading have some thread going through them, right? John the Baptist, through the inconvenience of being murdered on orders from Herod, ended his missionary work about the same time that Christ began his. It was some time later that Christ told Peter, whose original name had been Simon and whose new name given to him by Christ meant Rocky, that on this rock I will build, note future tense. Ew. Dummy. My church, Matthew 16:18. In other words, any church founded by John the Baptist must have been founded before Christ had a chance to found his own. The two could not be the same institution. Modern is a conspiracy. Modern day Baptists would do better if they claimed that their denomination was founded in the 17th century by English separatists, which, in fact, it was. Ignatius of Antioch. One of the earliest Catholic writers was Ignatius of Antioch, who was martyred in Rome in 107. As he was being taken to Rome under guard, he wrote letters to 7 local churches that he passed along the way. Among much else, he said, Ignatius noted that the Eucharist is the flesh of our Savior Jesus Christ, the flesh which suffered for our sins, the flesh which the Father, in his goodness, has raised again. This explicit and earlier affirmation of the real presence seems to be why there is never has been a Baptist church named after Ignatius. Justin Martyr. Among the earliest Christian writers, reminder, all of them were Catholics, were those known as the Catholic apologists. Not everyone nowadays knows the meaning of the term Catholic apologist. Here it is. A Catholic apologist is someone who goes around the country apologizing for being a Catholic. The earliest Catholic apologist was Justin Martyr. He was a philosopher who had been brought up a pagan. He experimented with various philosophies, found each one deficient, and became a Christian, because only Christianity made sense. He was martyred for his troubles, but got the last laugh because he became a saint. Gnosticism. The earliest apologists had to refute anti-Christians of various sorts. Among the biggest opponents of Christianity were the Gnostics. The word comes from the Greek for secret knowledge. Their knowledge was so secret that no one ever figured out exactly what they believed, including the Gnostics themselves. This made Gnosticism attractive because if you were a Gnostic, no one ever could prove that you believed incorrectly, since no one ever could prove just what it was that Gnostics were supposed to believe. This is also why there were no Gnostic martyrs. I thought the Catholic Church fought against philosophy during that era. Well, I mean, that may be why he was martyred. I can't remember why Justin Martyr was martyred. Let's see. Let's find out. Dang it. Oh, it was for his refusal to worship the Roman emperor and gods for his outspoken defense of Christianity. So there's that. Gnosticism persisted for centuries, at times almost disappearing, at other times gaining strength. It has seen a resurgence in recent years. Most entertainers and nearly all television journalists are Gnostics. Their beliefs, if any, are impossible to pin down. Fact. Montanism. One of the earliest heresies was Montanism. It was known as an enthusiastic movement because Its members were ancestors of the much later Holy Rollers, except that they didn't handle snakes, which Holy Rollers didn't either. Montanists were certain that the second coming was coming soon. Their leaders were amateur mathematicians who read the Bible and purported to be able to compute the timing of the last day accurately. They were not as good at mathematics as they supposed, as they repeatedly computed days, as their repeatedly computed days kept passing without incident. Montanism was begun by a man who, in a wild coincidence, was named Montanus. Centuries later, the 16th American president, in an equally wild coincidence, was named after the capital of Nebraska. Montanus, who lived in the 2nd century, began his religious career as a self-declared prophet. He did not obtain the hearing he expected. Self-declared prophets seldom do, so, there being many of them, he upped the ante and declared he was a paraclete promised by Christ. This got people's attention. Montanus began a speaking tour of Phrygia, which is said to have been named after its insalubrious climate, and soon won disciples, in particularly two wealthy ladies, Maximilia and Prisca, who deserted their husbands to follow Montanus, thus setting a precedent that would be seen in much later religious movements. So true, so true. Maximilla tried to prophesy on her own, saying, "After me, the end will come," except that after her end, it didn't. Louis XV was more prescient, unfortunately, when he said something similar. Montanism continued to be a problem for centuries, though Montanus himself didn't, as one might expect. Oh, excellent. Excellent. Thank you, guys. I do appreciate the views and the likes. Victor I. Not long after Montanus passed from the scene, the Bishop of Rome, Pope Victor I, declared that a different heretic called Polycrates of Ephesus, I always want to say Polycrates because I call Socrates Socrates, had earned excommunication for being a public nuisance. This was the earliest recorded occasion of the Pope issuing a disciplinary ruling regarding someone living far from Rome. It would not be the last occasion. It might not even have been the first, since most early records of such things don't seem to have been recorded. But Victor gets the credit. Such are the breaks of history, as every historian knows. Victor found himself dealing with yet another heretic, a man named Eleutherius. He was a wealthy resident of Byzantium who had apostatized in a recent persecution. He came to Rome, a city where he was not known, to hide his shame. He was found out anyway. He tried to excuse himself by saying that in denying Christ, he had not denied God because Christ was not God, but merely the highest of all God's creatures. This did not sit well with Victor, who excommunicated Eleutherius, who refused to recant. Eleutherius began his own sect and deliberately filled it with logicians and mathematicians and scientists. They studied not only the Bible, but such Greeks as Euclid, Galen, and Aristotle. They were smart people who were too smart for their own good, and in a few decades, the sect disappeared. Manichaeism. In the next century, the third, things began to become troublesome. There arose yet another sect, that of the Manichaeans. And that one, unlike the sect of the Eleutherius, lasted well more than 1,000 years, proving that longevity in error depends on more than just having a roster of logicians, mathematicians, and scientists. The Manichaeans appeared under many titles in later years, such as Bugras. I think I was saying that right. I'm not sure if someone can correct me. Cathars and Albigenses. And that was just in the Middle Ages. The founder of Manichaeism, in another of those wild coincidences, was a man called Mani. He was born in Persia and deliberately founded his new religion. It was intended to incorporate all the wisdom of the world's religions. For Mani, there had been 3 great religious leaders in history. Hey, Spider Dog, good to have you. Late or not. Christ, Zoroaster, and Buddha. I think the ordering there is a little off. Zoroaster predated Buddha, Buddha predated Christ, etc. The problem with them was that they only preached, never wrote. Joey Simpson in the house. Mani would fix that by writing, which he considered an effective means of communicating his thought. It worked. More than a century later, for example, Augustine, for a time, was won over to Manichaeism by virtue of the heretic's writings. Mani did not scruple to borrow from lesser religious leaders. 2. And like Montanus, he concluded that he himself really was the paraclete. As with Montanus, this tactic got people's attention. Mani and Montanus are credited with having invented the art of self-promotion. Chino Nino, not much, just knocking out streams today. One second. So I just wanted to make sure I had a definition correct. So the paraclete is the Holy Spirit. So that's one heck of self-promotion, if you ask me. Bugras, masculine noun, pejorative, chap. Origen was an original thinker, something that often is a detriment in theology. and often with good warrant. He was born in Alexandria around 185 and spent much of his life there, becoming a philosopher and theologian. He is said to have written many hundreds of books, almost none of which survive, perhaps because, after Origen's death, the Emperor Justinian declared him a heretic and ordered all of his books to be burned. One of the few books of Origen's to survive in its entirety is Against Celsus. Celsus was a pagan philosopher known as the top opponent of Christianity in the ancient world, and as the developer of a method to measure temperature. Origen is credited or discredited, depending on one's point of view, with teaching, oh boy, here we go, the apocatastasis. The notion that at the end of time, all creatures in hell, even Satan, will reconcile with God and enter heaven. So that kind of goes more along with Judaism, right? That Sheol is a place of redemption where you go to work out your sins that you did not ask forgiveness for, or that you completely rejected God in. He probably didn't teach this, but ended up being identified with the apocatastasis. Anyway, such being the breaks of theological history. Whatever Origen's view on such a final reconciliation, he held enough other questionable views that, although he was an early Christian writer, he never has been counted among the fathers of the church. Multiple claimants. The 3rd century was a time of turmoil, particularly at the top of the ruling ladder. When I was a lector at church, they had a phonics dictionary so you could try and sound out words, tongue twisters. Absolutely. I had to take Greek in high school, and I still can't say the words. It is it's like Hebrew. I just never had the talent or the brain for hard words or languages. I was not blessed in that. So mostly they went. In the 33 years from 251 to 284, there were 11 emperors. Not one of them died in his own bed. About half died on the battlefield, and the others were murdered. Either by the imperial troops who had elected them, or by the troops of their political opponents. At one point, there were 19 rival claimants to the throne, all claiming to be the real emperor. In the Middle Ages, more on this later, the best the church could do was to have 3 rival papal claimants at one time. That was considered progress, as was the fact that in the Middle Ages, nearly all popes died in their own beds. The Roman emperors were a fickle lot. Some of them tolerated Christianity, others persecuted it. Still, others seesawed between toleration and persecution. Diocletian is a good example. His wife and daughter were converts to Christianity, and he had many Christians working in the household. Yet he started a fierce persecution in 303. It didn't end until his successor, Constantine, issued the Edict of Milan in 313. Donatism. During Diocletian's persecution, not a few Christians cooperated with Roman authorities. When officials asked whether the Christians owned any religious books, they said yes and handed them over to the officials, who destroyed the books. This was more common in urban areas than in rural areas, where there was greater resistance to the persecutions. Some rural folks became resentful against those considered traditores, which means those who hand over holy things, and they began a movement called Donatism, which, in yet another wild coincidence, was named after a fellow Donatus, who had been elected Bishop of Carthage. The Donatists flourished in North Africa and were rigorists. They claimed that priests who had been traditores would not celebrate sacraments validly because the church consisted only of saints, not of sinners. This proved an attractive recruiting device for the Donatist sect, since many people wanted to associate only with others who were as faultless as they were. The sect remained active for centuries, disappearing only once Islam overran North Africa. One of the opponents of Donatism later in the 4th century was Augustine, who lucked out and had the chance to write against many heresies. Ben Buttercup, greetings. Do you have any new videos to share with us? Battle of Milvian Bridge. Constantine became the emperor some years after Diocletian retired. He had a rival whose name was Maxentius. Their armies met for battle at the Milvian Bridge, which is located a couple of miles from Rome's Flaminian Gate. The night before the battle, Constantine had a dream in which he saw a large cross in the sky and heard a voice saying, "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign, the cross, conquer. Sometimes abbreviated as IHS, those who have watched too many James Bond movies think IHS means in his or her majesty's service. Actually, IHS represents the first 3 letters of the name Jesus in Greek. So there is a double confusion. However that may be, Constantine followed the dream's instructions, and his army won. He entered Rome convinced that the real God was the one that the Christians worship, thus proving that he was an astute man. Constantine's vision. Constantine, church founder? Modern Protestant fundamentalists claim that it was Constantine who established the Catholic Church through his legalization of Christianity. This is not true, as these people would know if they had read the earlier parts of this book. No more need be said. Theodosius. Constantine, who reigned until 337, has been accused by modern writers of the fundamentalist persuasion of making Christianity the state religion. This also was untrue. The fellow wasn't even baptized until he was on his deathbed. Making Christianity the state religion was left to one of Constantine's successors, Emperor Theodosius, who reigned from 379 to 395, and who deserves proper credit. He was a rare thing among Roman emperors, a believing, practicing Catholic. This is why 15 and 16 centuries later, he never got a good press from secular historians. Besides, Theodosius didn't have a Milvian bridge to crow about, so he was less interesting than Constantine to write about. Arius. Early in the 4th century, there was a priest in Alexandria named Arius. He was a smart fellow who may have studied too much Greek philosophy. He probably also studied Eleutherius. He found himself unable to understand how Jesus could be at once God and man. Arius concluded that Jesus was just a man, though the best man ever. This was called doctrinal simplification, and it proved to be very popular. Arius himself proved to be very popular and a nuisance. And here we go, folks. The First Council of Nicaea. Or if you're going with the true Latin, I guess it would be Nicaea. Oh, newspeak. It's here. It's here, Woodrow. So Orwell really just studied the Catholic Church and came up with his ideas, is what you're saying, Woodrow. The first general or ecumenical council was called to deal with Arius' heretical teaching. It was held in 325 at Nicaea, in what is now Turkey. Arius attended and spelled out his beliefs plainly. The bishops in attendance were not impressed. At length, the council came up with the definitive definition that explained the relationship of God the Father and Jesus, the Son of God, the sole begotten of the Father. A minority of the bishops initially had wanted to use the term homoousios. I think he gets into homeostasis later. Was that definitive in the 11th edition? Wouldn't it be Doc Simp in the 11th edition, Woodrow? This may have been a 10th edition word. So the minority of the bishops initially had wanted to use the term homoiosis of like substance to explain the relative relationship. But the majority of the bishops settled on homoousios, which means of the same substance. This meant that Jesus wasn't merely like God in his essence, but actually was God himself. Or undoc, Yeah, I like undock. The only difference between the two Greek terms was the letter iota. Rendered in Latin characters, the letter iota, was the smallest Greek letter, but it was made even smaller in the word homoiousios. The first I was written beneath the preceding vowel, so scribes could save one letter space, which was a big deal before the invention of the linotype. Putting the first iota between the preceding letter made that iota really small, as though it were of no importance. The Arian party said, "Hey, what's the fuss? It doesn't make sense. An iota of difference which term we choose, so choose ours." The Catholic party said, "Pound sand, we have the votes." In the end, all but two of the bishops signed off on the new definition, which then became definitively definitive. I don't think that Newspeak would appreciate that sentence. Arianism gets imperial help. Kelly, they would not understand this. It contains actual humor and welcome. See, I can appreciate a good, well written Christian book, and we can talk about Christianity. I am not I am not this big bad Jewish monster. That I don't want any appointments with O'Brien, so you can have that. Arianism gets imperial help. That should have ended the matter, but it didn't. Arianism, as the heresy was known, took on a life of its own. Even many bishops and priests subscribed to it because it was easier to think of Christ as having one nature rather than two. Inasmuch as everyone in everyone's neighborhood had only one nature. Arianism lasted for centuries, and in practice, even if not with that title, it is held by many today. They believe that Jesus was the best man ever, but that's it. What kept Arianism going in the early years, well beyond the death of Arius, was its promotion by Roman emperors to whom Arius's party had appealed. By this time, the emperors had become used to sticking their nose into Christian business, and the results usually were bad. This fact could have been used by Thomas Jefferson to argue on behalf of the separation of church and state, but Jefferson belonged to no church at all, and so the thought never occurred to him. That thought might ruffle some feathers. Athanasius. To combat Arianism, the church had one of the greatest bishops of antiquity, Athanasius. He was elected Bishop of Alexandria, the most important see in North Africa, and he soon went into battle against the Arians. There were so many of them that he was known as Athanasius contra mundum, or Athanasius against the world. He was the first and last man in history to be given that sobriquet. And just as well, you don't end up with many friends if you're against the world. Hmm. Sound like a feller we know. Julian, the non-apostate. All of the emperors who succeeded Constantine were Christians, or at least nominally, except for one. He came to be known as Julian the Apostate. But this was a little unfair. He never had been a Christian, so he couldn't have apostatized from the Christian religion. But he did seek to bring back paganism. That worked for about 2 weeks. So we get the Confessions. Augustine. Augustine was the greatest theologian of antiquity. His mother's was named Monica. She is famous for having prayed unceasingly that he would straighten out his life and become a Christian. Eventually, he did so, but only after his mother became thoroughly exasperated with him, which is distressingly common when mothers have sons. Augustine ended up as bishop of the city of Hippo, which was located on the shore of the Mediterranean, in which what is now Algeria. The city's name was a curious one, since the nearest known hippopotami were located along the Upper Nile, nearly 2,000 miles away. Augustine, best known as the author of the Confessions, the book was a runaway bestseller, perhaps because the title suggests salacious content. But it contained nothing of the sort. Many ancient readers seem to have been disappointed, but they had no recourse. This was in the days before Amazon, when it was not possible to return books purchased under a misapprehension. Augustine published his final book, The City of God, in 426. 4 years later, he died at Hippo. And 3 years after that, Hippo was captured and destroyed by barbarians known as the Vandals because they engaged in vandalism, which had been a problem for centuries. Apparently, the Vandals had become upset on discovering that the Confessions wasn't what they thought it to be. Pelagianism. One heretic against whom Augustine wrote was Pelagius. Great band, too. The two men were born in the same year, 354. This was convenient, since otherwise 354 was a dull year. The only other historical events being a circus and theater shows hosted by Emperor Constantius, to mark the 30th year of his reign. Reacting against Manichaeism, which held that spiritual things were made by God and were good, while material things were made by a bad creator and were bad. Pelagius, does anybody else's brain go to Star Wars with this? Taught that everything created was good, and therefore God could not have allowed men to have a fallen nature. They were free to do good or evil and could live perfect lives if they so chose. Adam's sin didn't corrupt everyone's human nature. It only set a bad example, which could be ignored the way we ignore bad examples set by bank robbers. Pelagius's teaching was welcomed by those short of cash. Martin of Tours. When Augustine and Pelagius were 43, there died a famous bishop, Martin of Tours. He was the first person who wasn't a martyr to be recognized as a saint. Before that, you weren't a saint unless you managed to get yourself killed, which was easy to do in the early centuries. Much later, Martin, who for a time had been a soldier and had gotten around quite a bit, became the patron saint of travelers, cruise lines, and tourist agencies, and that is how he got his title. Nestorius. Nestorius became the patriarch of Constantinople in 428. He immediately caused a public stir by claiming that the Virgin Mary should be called Christ-bearer, Christokos, but not God-bearer, Theotokos, Theotokos. Nestorius wanted to emphasize the distinction between Christ's divine nature and his human nature, but he overdid it. People were not happy with him, and a general council was convened in 431 at Ephesus in present-day Turkey to determine which Tokos was the right one. Nestorius lost the argument, lost his bishopric, and was exiled to a monastery in the Egyptian desert, where he died 20 years later. His theological ideas did not die with him, and several religious bodies in the East adopted some of his views even to this day. So the Eastern Orthodox Church does not believe in the Trinity. They believe in the separation of God, Christ, and the Spirit, that they are not the same person. The Council of Chalcedon. Although no one knew at the time, Isaac Newton's principle of equal and opposite reaction came into play. As a response to Nestorianism, not exactly as a contradiction of its teachings, but rather the teaching of Arianism, there arose the heresy of monophysitism, which held that in Christ there was only one nature, the divine, and not two, the divine and human. This was the opposite of Arianism, which held that Christ had only a human nature. Although monophysites and Arians often came to blows with one another, they should not be considered enemies but competitors. Their underlying principle was the same. In Christ, there could be only one nature. The thinking was that it was hard to think how Christ could manage two natures, so he must have had only one, and it was just a question of choosing between the two. The matter was decided by still another general council, this time held in 451 in Chalcedon, another town in present-day Turkey. Turkey sure had a lot to do with Christian history. No one has ever explained the attraction of Turkey back then. There weren't even any Turks there yet. The council decided that both disputants were wrong and that Christ indeed had two natures. The monophysites and the Arians also were told to pound sand. So, the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire collapsed officially, as distinguished from unofficially, in 476, when the last Roman emperor, a young fellow named Romulus Augustulus was shoved off his throne by a barbarian general. The barbarians still seem to have been upset with Augustine. Romulus Augustulus disappeared into the dustbin of history, and so did the Roman Empire. It was dark in the dustbin, so the succeeding period was known as the Dark Ages. People forgot about the confessions and no longer were upset with Augustine, so something good came from the affair. Benedict. Benedict was born in Nursia, which was not far from Assisi. At least one had access to a car when Benedict didn't. He has become a patron saint of Europe, whereas Patrick, see next entry, has had to settle for a lesser place and merely gets an annual parade in New York. Hey, but it's a good holiday. Thank you. Benedict was adept at founding monasteries, about a dozen of them in and around Subiaco, where he began his religious life by spending 3 years hiding out in a cave high on the side of a cliff. He also founded the Abbey of Monte Cassino, where he died. Benedict was famous for writing a rule, which is a set of regulations for monks. His rule was popular because it wasn't as strict as regulation governing monks who lived in the East, such as in Egypt. Benedict's motto was Ora et Labora, which means pray and work. This appealed to men who liked to pray, but not all the time, and who liked to work, but not all the time. It never appealed to men who liked to neither pray nor work. Such men became politicians instead. Is there a political future in someone's path? Uh-oh. We know what's coming next, folks. We have a bishop and some snakes. Patrick. In Britain, no one knows exactly when or where a boy of 16 named Patrick was captured in a raid by the Irish and sold into slavery. After 6 years of working as a shepherd, he managed to escape to Gaul, where he eventually became a bishop and was assigned to return to Ireland to preach the faith there. Although there already were Catholics in Ireland, Patrick came to be known as the founder of Catholicism on that island. This was good because he happened to have the most popular Irish name. Patrick is a good, strong Irish name. Patrick was successful in reorganizing the church in Ireland. He also helped Ireland materially, being said to have driven snakes out of the country. Where he drove them is unknown, but there are 6 municipalities in the United States named after him, and each one is noted for a high incidence of reptiles. That may not be coincidence. Gregory the Great. While Benedict is known as the founder of Western Montanism, It was Pope Gregory the Great, who is called the founder of the Middle Ages. Yeah, Kelly, obviously it is. Mester is of questionable origin, though, eh? He was born in Rome of an aristocratic family in 540, 8 years before Benedict died. They never met. It was Gregory who sent the first missionaries to Britain. Among them was Augustine, who was not the late bishop of Hippo, but another man of the same name. This other Augustine became popular in Britain, but he was not the Augustine for whom the city of Augustine, Florida was named. And just as well, since the city's residents never have learned how to pronounce the name of their city properly. Can the snakes be sent back? I don't know. They may have a Patrick in waiting to drive them back in greater numbers. And you know, now in the South, we still have to have our rattlesnake rodeos, so it's not conducive to our our traditions now. As for Gregory, he became quite a good background. His father was a Roman senator. That was an honorable position and is not to be confused with modern day senators of whatever country. Gregory proved to be an accomplished leader. He cleaned up and reorganized many things in the church. He was the first successful church administrator. He also may have been the last. However, that may be, it is undisputable that he was an accomplished writer. From henceforth, serpents, formerly known as snakes, are now called Patricks. Hear, hear, huzzah. Especially important were Gregory's writings and regulations regarding the Mass. Before his time, the Mass in the West existed in many variants. He revised the Mass, and by the Middle Ages, he was known as the father of Christian worship. He ended up being admired not just by Catholics, but by Eastern Orthodox and even Protestants. John Calvin declared that Gregory was the last good pope. Council of Toledo. After the fall of the Roman Empire, many peoples migrated from one part of Europe to another. The Visigoths, or Tods, were a Germanic tribe that headed west, first to Gaul, from which they were booted, and then to Hispania, which later became Spain. The Visigoths of Spain were Arians, but that was fixed at the Council of Toledo in 589. The Visigothic prince, Ricard, and his nobles were in attendance, as were 64 bishops. The prince and most of his entourage formally repudiated Arianism and subscribed to a profession of faith that included the Filioque cause, the very thing that threw Eastern Christians into a snit 3 centuries later. Tautogothics. I like Tautogothics. Carrying out the edicts of the council was left to Leander, the Archbishop of Seville, who was a friend of Gregory the Great. So Jeff is now Geoffrey the Great. So saith I, and let it be so. Leander died in 600 and was succeeded by his brother Isidore of Seville, who, as already noted, is counted as the last father of the Church of the West. One result of the Council of Toledo was the burgeoning union of church and state. Loyalty to the church became equated with patriotism. Uh-oh, folks. We're getting into some familiar territory that people want to bring to our shores. And anything non-Catholic became regarded as anti-Spanish. This attitude had its negative elements, but it gave Spanish Catholics cohesion when Spain was overrun by the Moors. Monothelitism. First here was Arianism, which said Christ had only a human nature. There was monophysitism, which said that he had only a divine nature. The long, sorry stories of these heresies should have ended the infatuation with the number one, but they didn't. Theological hobby horses being difficult to dismount from. In the 7th century, they developed a new heresy. Monothelitism. Dear Lord, these heresies, which said Christ had but one will, the divine, and that he had no human will at all. The chief prophet of this theory was Sergius, the patriarch of Constantinople. But Sergius didn't act alone. He had secular help. As had become commonplace, the Byzantine emperor, Heraclius, in this case, intruded into the fray. Emperors, having become persistent ecclesiastical busybodies, Heraclius saw monothelitism as a way to undermine the monophysitism that still persisted in some parts of his empire. He would play on one theological speculation against the other. In order to unite his empire, of course, it didn't work. On his part, Sergius wrote to Pope Honorius, asking him to affirm a theological argument that underlay the monothelite position. Honorius replied with an ambiguous letter saying the parties should calm down and stifle the argument. That was not helpful. Hey, Lucy. And it ended up making Honorius look incompetent, mostly because he was. What's more, it ended up getting Honorius condemned, though posthumously at the Third Council of Constantinople, which opened in 680 and had its focus the condemnation of monothelitism. The council and its condemnations would be official until Pope Leo II confirmed them. He confirmed the condemnation of the heresy, but interpreted the council as condemning Honorius not for teaching error, but for imprudent economy of silence. In other words, for not speaking up when he should have. Ever since, Honorius has been exhibit number one for those arguing against papal infallibility, even though Honorius never claimed to be deciding anything infallibly. Such are the breaks of ill-intentioned argumentation. Okay, folks, I am burnt. Um, Let me see what Jeff's plans are, if any. Dang it. I should have done this earlier, but I got into reading, but now my right eye is doing things. My voice makes me want to sleep too, Spider Dog. I don't think in a good way. Give him a minute to respond. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Want me to break into my musical songs? I'm not going to do it. I'm just wondering if you wanted me to. So we hadn't even gotten to 1054 yet. So we hadn't even gotten into the meat of the book. Okay, I will sing a little bit of "Oh, Wiley dear." I can't hit it. My throat is too worn right now. The pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. Yeah, it's not happening today. No voice exercises. How about some Jewish grooves? Slow Jewish grooves. I would have to get some music going for that. And it would be mostly hymns. Let's see. He's not replying. He may be busy with the terrorist. Um, so yes, it is. It is definitely the Hebraic reading of Torah is a song. Same with Psalms and Proverbs. I mean everything there. The imprudent economy of silence. And touch the sound of silence. And in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more. All right, I'll post anything if he doesn't on Discord. Um, Probably shouldn't have worn my voice out on other people's streams in between mine. But this is right at an hour and a half, so I think we'll do well. Uh, but I'm definitely going to do Proverbs tomorrow, and I may get back into this. I'll see what scheduling, but it'll be a little later. Give everybody the ability to get on instead of doing things so early. So, cup of tea and lemon. That's how I prep my voice. So, no, it's just tired, Linda. Anyway, all right. Well, I will talk to you guys hopefully in a little bit. I do need to eat something. I've been spending entirely too much time on YouTube today, getting some brain rot. Yeah, I always see like cats around. So no, man, I've gotta load up that other one. So anyhow, talk to you guys.